Welcome to Little Legend Studios Essentials Airbrushing. In the first part of this video we'll see how we can disassemble and reassemble the model. Now that nozzle there, I never unclip that. Previous models that I've had of this airbrush, I've always stripped the threads, ruining the airbrush. So I always keep that on. I never disassemble that. But the rest, the airbrush, how you saw it, was how I disassemble it to give it a thorough clean through. So this is the basic assembly. Now, even though models will differ, I'm sure that for, well, all airbrushes I've seen, the majority of them are put together in this manner. So the trigger goes through, and then you have this piece. So it's important you have this upside down Y, and the tip of it sits flush against the trigger, and then we tighten that up. Now we don't need to worry about how hard we tighten that. You won't strip the threads there, so you tighten that up as much as you possibly can. Strain those muscles, and you should be able to feel resistance with the trigger control. Next, we take the needle. Now after cleaning, I would suggest adding some super lube or any kind of airbrush lube. And this is how you apply it. So this just helps the trigger control and helps maintain the health of the airbrush. So all you have to do is just run it along the needle. We don't need much, very thin amount, and then pop it in. Now we need to make sure that the needle sits flush against the front nozzle, and then we use this chuck to tighten it. This is the protective cap. Screws on like so. Now that portion is a limiter, but we'll talk about that in a bit. Then these are the protective caps. Now the one on the left, the one I'm screwing in now, isn't essential to the workings of the airbrush. That's merely there to protect the needle. So you see this limiter here, you can screw it further in and the trigger won't pull back as much. So let's tighten it even more. See, it's not moving at all. I barely ever use this feature, but it is useful to have. There's another one just underneath the cap that allows a splatter pattern. Finally, we need to attach the hose onto the bottom. I'd recommend doing this when the compressor is off, otherwise it will shoot everywhere. And that's it, we are ready to roll. So just to show a different airbrush, I have the Infinity 2-in-1. I see the nozzle slightly different. Now when it comes to colour changes, we can't unlatch this piece, otherwise all the paint's going to flow out to the top. But that is an example of how airbrushes can differ, but essentially they go together in pretty much all the same way. Our discussion will revolve around the gravity feed, which means paint is drawn down the cap and then air is pushed through the central gun. So when we depress the nozzle, air shoots out, and when we draw it back, paint flows out. With PSI, I found the sweet spot to be around the 15 to 20 PSI range. When it's too high, like 40 we have there, it tends to sputter everywhere. We have no control. Same if we go very light on the PSI, so if you're running around 5, it just kind of leaks out. But this is what it looks like with 15 to 20 PSI. I think I have mine around 17 at the point of recording. But experiment with your own. The writing exercise will really help you, which is coming up next. Let's go through some sample exercises. Now when you get the airbrush for the first time, you just don't know what PSI to run it at, how much paint to liquid dilution you need, what liquid dilution you need. Now there are many guides online, and they all tell you to get around the consistency of milk. Well, this isn't strictly true depending on the kind of technique, but as a very rough rule of thumb, we need to start with a thicker solution, and then the longer we go into an airbrushing session, the thinner it will become. So as a beginning exercise, just to get you used to the trigger control, PSI levels, and how much dilution you need, let's start with a sample exercise I like running my students through. So I've just mixed together some Forge World thinner. Unfortunately, it's no longer for sale. I know it's teasing. And some black primer. So that's the kind of dilution we've gone for. There you go. Then when we run it through, paint comes out. Okay, let's have a look at some of the effects you can get with an airbrush. So the closer we have the airbrush to a piece of paper, the more definitive the mark, the stronger the paint will become. Now the farther away we bring the airbrush away from the surface, the more diffuse the paint will become. So the closer we get a harder, more defined edge, the farther away we get a more diffuse light. Now, the first exercise I want you to do is write your name 10 times. Before every session that you have, before every time you airbrush, especially if you're new to airbrushing, even if you're an old hand, I want you to write your name 10 times on a piece of paper until you can write it so fine it matches your normal handwriting. So that's the aim, and this will help trigger control like nothing else, and it will also help you out with how much PSI and dilution you need. If you find that the paint is just spidering everywhere, then the PSI is too high. If it's too low, it will kind of sputter out. So writing your name is a very, very worthwhile exercise. The second exercise, I want you to draw a circle with a light source in that rather handily black spot up there. Add a single point of shadow, and then draw your airbrush back to create a softer shadow. In effect, we're trying to add volume to a two-dimensional object. So this will help us like nothing else when it comes to defining volumes on our miniatures. So if you think of like a Space Marine shoulder pad, for example, if we want to give that actual light and a bit of reality to the shading process, this is the technique we will be using. So again, we can use it on a different shape. Got a cone here that I just want to develop, and I want you to draw 3 shapes before every session. So write your name 10 times and draw 3 shapes. Next up, we have color changes. So we don't need to strip the airbrush every time we need to do a color change. Simply take some airbrush cleaner. It doesn't really matter which brand you use, they're all pretty much the same. Then I put some into the cap. I take an old brush to wipe away any dried excess, the excess paint that's dried on the side of the cap. Now I don't want to run this solution through my airbrush. You have dry, dead flecks of paint there, quite hardened. You don't want this stuff flowing through the airbrush. So once you've just knocked it off the side panels, I got a trusty towel, never going away without the towel, and then I empty it into there. Next stage, I take more cleaner and I pop it into the cap, and then I run this solution through. So we aren't running so much paint through the airbrush, we aren't trying to battle with it. I would highly advise you buy one of these things. It's such a godsend. Okay, to see whether the paint's running out okay, add some more cleaner or some water and run it on a clean piece of paper next to you. If it runs out clear and clean, you're perfect for the next colour. The pre-shade forms about 90% of the core skills we'll be using with the airbrush. So this is a line of thinking that takes us throughout the miniature painting process. Well, my miniature painting process at least. So I normally work from a black base coat and I'll add white directly on top, especially with complicated miniatures. Space Marines, we more or less know where to place our shadows and highlights, but when it comes to really bizarre miniatures like this, the Raging Heroes, I'm not exactly sure what she's called. I'm using her as a Greater Demon. So I've undercoated her black, and I have no idea where to start. I don't know what the hell I'm going to do highlighting her. So, in order for me to break that spell, whenever you get a miniature like that, it's like, oh my god, where the hell do I even begin? Well, you airbrush directly from above. So I'm just airbrushing in a zenithal highlighting pattern. So zenithal means lighting from above. And this should help my eye see the details, where I want to put certain colours, where I want to have hue transitions, shadows, colour modulation and all the rest of it. It just helps me see the miniature a lot better. So, don't want to drop it. We'll need 2 to 3 base coats, and already you can see it's a lot more defined. And from here I can start to bring my airbrush a little closer to the surface and define some of these portions a bit more. So the flesh cloak, these bodies writhing in agony underneath her, her face especially. There we have it. That is how we go about breaking down complicated miniatures in the pre-shade. If you were interested in more pre-shading techniques or a bit more theory behind it, please feel free to sign up for the lessons, one-to-one lessons. I should have more openings available soon. Okay, paint dilution and PSI. So I've whacked up the PSI to about 40. Okay, next up we have glazing, or what I like to call filter layers. Now once we've built up a base tone consistency, we need to push the highlights and shadows a little farther than we may feel entirely comfortable with. From here we can apply filter layers. So these are very, very thin layers applied on top of a hue, on top of a colour to modulate it. In this case, I feel like the orange is slightly too aggressive and I would like to knock that back. So the paint dilution that we've talked about, we need it even thinner at this point. We need about, about 4 parts thinner to 1 part paint. So you see the dilution there is way, way too thick. So instead of battling to thin this down, I could just simply empty it out, and any excess paint we have, we could just reapply thinner. So let's see the paint dilution now. It's barely anything. So one of my students called these believe layers. So when you add them on top of a surface, it doesn't really make that much of a difference to the hue, the underlying hue. But you just need to believe that it does. So I've added a bit of ink to this as well, just to up the saturation. You need to so the ink isn't essential for these stages. It's just something I wanted to add to make the red a bit more vibrant. The technique simply revolves around taking a colour and diluting it to the point that when you apply it there's practically no change. So you can see I'm adding that layer, and it's a very, very minute, subtle change. Now in real life you may not even be able to detect a change, but you just have to believe that it has. You'll be able to see the wetness of it, and we don't want to overload the miniature with this. We just want very thin films of paint coating the underlying layer. Okay, another technique that you can only really do with an airbrush is realistic chipping techniques or weathering. So I'm just applying a layer of heavy chipping medium by Mig Jimenez. Once that dries, I can take some engine grime, again by Mig Jimenez. And this technique would be practically impossible to do with a just regular brush. So we're really starting to see why we need an airbrush to create these kind of effects. I'm just adding this all over the lower surface. Now I don't think I shook up my paint well enough here, so it's starting to bead a little bit here. This isn't exactly what you need, but I've filmed another segment after this showing you how it should look. I mean, it still looks good. It looks like the paint is blistering through heat haze. So even though this isn't exactly what I intended, it still looks cool. So this was my intended coverage. So when you apply it on, don't be shy with this stuff, really lather it on. Now this is an enamel based paint, so you do not want to mix this with water. You do not want to use any technique that involves water or water dilution with this technique, because the water actually activates the heavy chipping fluid. So it's all enamel based products. So this is why we don't want to use any water. I'm taking a sponge and I'm dampening it with water to activate the heavy chipping fluid underneath. You can already see it's starting to lift off. See all these beads of water? So when I run a brush on top of this, all of that's going to come away. There you go, that creates a blistered, pockmarked appearance to make it look like re-entry burns. A technique that would be practically impossible to do without an airbrush. Right, what paints should you use when it comes to airbrushing? Well, there's as many different answers to this as there are paint manufacturers. I've personally found that Scale 75 works very, very well through an airbrush, and you can use those as normal acrylic paints as well. Vallejo have a pedigree in airbrush paints that extends nearly 25 years, I believe. So they, again, are excellent. One thing I would recommend with this Vallejo is stay away from their white and black. I do tend to find that they come out slightly rubbery. Now, I'm not sure whether it's because I've had bad batches or simply because I'm not using them with the right thinners. But that's been my personal experience. Formula P3, also an excellent paint range that you can use just as a normal acrylic paint, and they do thin down exceptionally well with thinners. The Games Workshop paints, they are very, very highly pigmented, so they are excellent for one coat coverage, but they do have a tendency to clog up your airbrush. So while they are excellent paints to use just as straight acrylic paint, I personally would not want, I couldn't recommend them to run through your airbrush. I haven't had much experience with their air range, so I can't comment on that. When buying paints, it really is up to you. Vallejo, Scale 75, Formula P3, you're on very good ground there. But one thing I would recommend above all else is the white. Make sure you buy yourself some Medea Com Art opaque white. This stuff is a godsend. So white is one of those problem colours when it comes to airbrushing. It clogs up the airbrush frequently, and it does cause those annoying breaks in your painting process that you're not painting, you're just cleaning up after yourself. So buy yourself some of that, and that should help. Now, thinners. I am experimenting with new thinners since Forge World stopped doing their own thinning medium. I love that stuff. So I've bought some Scale 75. I'm putting that through the paces as we speak. So far, very good. I highly recommend it, and much cheaper than the Forge World equivalent. Another thing I can recommend is Vallejo thinner. So again, these guys have the pedigree. These guys know what they're doing. They've been in business for long enough. When it comes to airbrushing Tamiya paints, do not use normal airbrush thinner. So the Scale 75 stuff and the Vallejo stuff, they can be used through with different paint ranges. I haven't had much of a problem using them with Vallejo, Formula P3 and Scale 75. But when it comes to Tamiya, always use the X20A thinner. It's especially formulated for Tamiya paints. Don't try and use anything else. Next up, we have a buying guide. So I would recommend that you switch over to the PDF tutorial at this point, the accompanying PDF. and this will give you a much more detailed explanation of what kind of things we'd be looking for. So thank you very much guys for joining me for this quick essentials video. I hope you've enjoyed it. Any feedback, please feel free to send along to me, and I'll catch you next time.